So you mentioned Department of Education, but there's also the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
And there's a very large number of very powerful people that have gotten used to and a budget that's increasing, and the number of wars and military conflicts that's increasing. So if we could just talk about that. So
Sure.
if this is the number one priority, it's like there's difficulty levels here. The DoD it would be probably the hardest. So let's take that on. What's your view on the military-industrial complex, Department of Defense, and wars in general?
So I think the nanny state, I'm against it overall. I'm against the foreign policy nanny state as well. Let me start from that as the starting off point, and then I'll tell you about my views on the DoD and our defense. First of all, I think that, and I think that it was easy for many people from the neocon school of thought to caricature my views with the media at their side. But actually, my own view is, if it's in the interest of the United States of America to provide certain levels of protection to U.S. allies, we can do that as long as those allies actually pay for it. And I think that's important for two reasons. The less important reason is it's still money for us, right? It's not like we're swimming in a cash surplus right now. We're at $34 trillion national debt and growing. And, I think pretty soon the interest payments are going to be the largest line item in our own federal budget. So it's not like we have money willy-nilly to just hand over for free. That's the less important reason, though. The more important reason is that it makes sure that our allies have actual skin in the game to not have skewed incentives to actually enter conflicts where they're not actually bearing the full cost of those conflicts. So take NATO, for example. Most NATO countries, literally a majority of NATO countries today, do not pay or contribute 2% of their GDP to their own national defense, which is supposedly a requirement to be in NATO. So majority of NATO countries are failing to meet their basic commitment to be in NATO in the first place. Germany particularly is, I think, arbitraging the hell out of the United States of America. And I don't think that I'm not going to be some sort of, shrill voice here saying, so therefore we should not be supporting any allies or providing security blankets. No, I'm not going in that direction. What I would say is you got to pay for it, right? Pay for your fair share. A, because we're not swimming in excess money ourselves. But B, as it tells us that you actually have skin in the game for your own defense, which actually then makes nations far more prudent in the risks that they take, whether or not they enter war, versus if somebody else is paying for it and somebody else is providing our security guarantee, hey, again, might as well, take the gamble and see where I end up at the end of a war, versus the restraint that imposes on the decision-making of those allies. So now let's bring this home to the Department of Defense. I think the top goal of the U.S. defense policy establishment should be to provide for the national defense of the United States of America. And the irony is that's what we're actually doing most poorly. We're not really using, other than the Coast Guard, we're not really using the U.S. military to prevent crossings at our own southern border and crossings at our other borders. In fact, the United States of America, our homeland, I believe is less secure today than it has been in a very long time. Vulnerable to threats from hypersonic missiles, where China and Russia certainly has capabilities in excess of that of the United States. Missiles, hypersonic means faster than the speed of sound, that could hit the United States, including those carrying nuclear warheads. We are more vulnerable to super EMP attacks, electromagnetic pulse attacks, that could, without exaggeration, some of this could be from other nations, some of this could even be from solar flares, cause significant mass casualty in the United States of America. The electric grid's gone. It's not an exaggeration to say if that happened, planes would be falling out of the sky because our chips really depend on those will be affected by those electromagnetic pulses. More vulnerable to cyber attacks. I know this, people start yawning and say, okay, boring stuff, super EMP, cyber, whatever. No, actually, it is pretty relevant to whether or not you actually are facing the risk of not getting your insulin because your refrigerator doesn't work anymore, or your food can't be stored, or your car or your ability to fly in an airplane is impaired. Okay. So I think that these are serious risks where our own national defense spending has been wholly inadequate. So I'm not one of these people that says, we decrease versus increase national defense spending. We're not spending it in the right places. The number one place we need to be spending it is actually in protecting our national defense. And I think protecting our own physical homeland. And I think we actually need an increase in spending on protecting our own homeland. But that is different from the agenda of foreign interventionism and foreign nanny-stateism for its own stake, where we should expect more and demand more of our allies to provide for their own national defense, and then provide the relevant security guarantees to allies where that actually advances the interests of the United States of America. So that's what I believe. And, I think this process has been corrupted by what Dwight Eisenhower famously in his farewell address called the military-industrial complex in the United States. But I think it's bigger than just I think it's easy to tell the tales of the financial corruption. It's a kind of cultural corruption and conceit that just because a certain number of people in that expert class have a belief, that their belief happens to be the right one because they can scare you with what the consequence would be if you don't follow their advice. And one of the beauties of the United States is, at least in principle, we have civilian control of the military. The person who we elect to be the U.S. president is the one that actually is the true commander-in-chief. I have my doubts of whether it operates that way. I think it is quite obvious that Joe Biden is not a functioning commander-in-chief of the United States of America, yet on paper, supposedly we still are supposed to call him that. But at least in theory, we're supposed to have civilian control of the U.S. military. And I think that one of the things that leader needs to do is to ask the question of, again, the mission. What's the purpose of this U.S. military in the first place? At the top of the list should be to protect the homeland and the people who actually live here, which we're failing to do. So that's where I land on that question.
Wait, okay, there's a lot of stuff to ask. First of all, on Joe Biden, you mean he's functionally not in control of the U.S. military because of the age factor or because of the nature of the presidency?
It's a good question. I would say in his case, it's particularly accentuated because it's both. In his case, I don't think anybody in America anymore believes that Joe Biden is the functioning president of the United States of America. How could he be? He wasn't even sufficiently functioning to be the candidate after a debate that was held in June. There's no way he's going to be in a position to make the most important decisions on a daily and demanding basis to protect the leading nation in the world. Now, more generally, though, I think we have a deeper problem that even when it's not Joe Biden, in general, the people we elect to run the government haven't really been the ones running the government. It's been the unelected bureaucrats and the bureaucratic deep state underneath that's really been making the decisions. So I've done business in a number of places. I've traveled to Japan. And there's an interesting corporate analogy. Sometimes if you get outside of politics, people can, I find, listen and pay attention a little bit more because of politics. It's so fraught right now that if you start talking to somebody who disagrees with you about the politics of it, you're just butting heads, but not really making progress. So let's just make the same point, but go outside of politics for a second. So I was traveling to Japan. I was having a late night dinner with a CEO of a Japanese pharmaceutical company. And, it takes a while to really get him to open up, culturally speaking, in Japan, a couple nights of karaoke and whatnot, maybe late night restaurant, whatever it is. Well, we built a good enough relationship where he was very candid with me. He said, I'm the CEO of the company. I could go and find the head of a research unit and tell him, okay, this is a project we're no longer working on as a company. We don't want to spend money on it. We're going to spend money somewhere else. And he'll look me in the eye and he'll say, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll come back 6 months later and find that they're spending exactly the same amount of money on those exact same projects. I'll tell him, no, we agreed. I told you that you're not going to spend money on this project and we have to stop now. I should have stopped 6 months ago. Get a slap on the wrist for it. He says, yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yes. No, of course. That's correct. Come back 6 months later. Same person is spending the same money on the same project. And here's why. Historically in Japan, and I should say in Japan, this is changing now. It's changing now. But historically, until very recently, and even to an extent now, it's near impossible to fire people. So if somebody works for you and you can't fire them, that means they don't actually work for you. It means in some deeper perverse sense, you work for them because you're responsible for what they do without any authority to actually change it. So I think most people who have traveled in Japan and Japanese corporate culture through the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s, and maybe even some vestiges in the 2020s, wouldn't really dispute what I just told you. Now, we're bringing it back to the more contentious terrain. I think that's basically how things have worked in the executive branch of the federal government of the United States of America. You have these so-called civil service protections on the books. Now, if you really read them carefully, I think that there are areas to provide daylight for a truly constitutionally well-trained president to act. But apart from those, that's a contrarian view that I have, that bucks conventional wisdom. But apart from that caveat, in general, the conventional view has been the U.S. president can't fire these people. There's 4 million federal bureaucrats, 99.9% of them can't be touched by the person who the people who elected to run the executive branch can't even fire those people. It's like the equivalent of that Japanese CEO. And so that culture exists every bit as much in the federal bureaucracy of the United States of America as it did in Japanese corporate culture through the 1990s. And that's a lot of what's wrong with not just the way that our Department of Defense is run and our foreign policy establishment is run, but I think it applies to a lot of the domestic policy establishment as well. And to come back to the core point, how are we going to save this republic? This is the debate in the conservative movement right now. So this is maybe a little bit spicy for some Republicans to sort of swallow right now. And, my top focus is making sure that we win the election. But let's just move the ball forward a little bit and skate to where the puck is going here. Okay? Yes, let's say we win the election, all is well and dandy. Okay, what's the philosophy that determines how we govern? There's a little bit of a fork in the road amongst conservatives, where there are those who believe that the right answer now is to use that regulatory state and use those levers of power to advance our own pro-conservative, pro-American, pro-worker goals. And I'm sympathetic to all of those goals. But I don't think that the right way to do it is to create a conservative regulatory state that replaces a liberal regulatory state. I think the right answer is actually to get in there and shut it down. I don't want to replace the left-wing nanny state with a right-wing nanny state. I want to get in there and actually dismantle the nanny state. And I think it has been a long time in the United States, maybe ever in modern history, that we've had a conservative leader at the national level who makes it their principal objective to dismantle the nanny state in all of its forms. The entitlement state, the regulatory state, and the foreign policy nanny state. That was a core focus of my candidacy. One of the things that I wish, and this is on me, not anybody else, that I should have done better was to make that more crystal clear as a focus without getting distracted by a lot of the shenanigans, let's just say, that happen as sideshows during a presidential campaign, but call that a lesson learned, because I do think it's what the country needs now more than ever.
Yeah, it's a really, really powerful idea. It's actually something that Donald Trump ran on in 2016.
It's drain the swamp.
Drain the swamp. I think by most accounts, maybe you can disagree with me, he did not successfully do so. He did fire a bunch of people, more than usual. But
can I say a word about the conditions he was operating in? Because I think that's why I'm far more excited for this time around, is that a lot has changed in the legal landscape. So Donald Trump did not have the Supreme Court backdrop in 2016 that he does today. So there's some really important cases that have come down from the Supreme Court. One is West Virginia versus EPA. I think it's probably the most important case of our generation. In 2022, that came down and said that if Congress has not passed a rule into law itself through the halls of Congress, and it relates to what they call a major question, a major policy or economic question, it can't be done by the stroke of a pen by a regulator, an unelected bureaucrat either. That quite literally means most federal regulations today are unconstitutional. Then this year comes down a different and big one, another big one from the Supreme Court in the Loper-Bright case, which held that historically, for the last 50 years in this country, the doctrine has been, it's called Chevron deference. It's a doctrine that says that federal courts have to defer to an agency's interpretation of the law. They now toss that out the window and said, no, the federal courts no longer have to defer to an agency's interpretation of what the law actually is. The combination of those two cases is seismic in its impact for the regulatory state. There's also another great case that came down was SEC versus JARCASY. And the SEC is one of these agencies that embodies everything we're talking about here. The SEC, among other agencies, has tribunals inside that not only do they write the rules, not only do they enforce those rules, they also have these judges inside the agency that also interpret the rules and determine and dole out punishments. That doesn't make sense if you believe in separation of powers in the United States. So the Supreme Court put an end to that and said that practice at the SEC is unconstitutional. Actually, as a side note, the Supreme Court has said countless practices and rules written by the SEC, the EPA, the FTC in recent years were outright unconstitutional. Think about what that means for a constitutional republic. That supposedly these law enforcement agencies the courts have now said, especially this year, the courts have now said that their own behaviors actually break the law. So the very agencies entrusted with supposedly enforcing the law are actually behaving with utter, blatant disregard for the law itself. That's un-American. It's not tenable in the United States of America. But thankfully, we now have a Supreme Court that recognizes that. So, whether or not we have a second Trump term, well, that's up to the voters. But even whether or not that now takes advantage of that backdrop the Supreme Court has given us to actually gut the regulatory state, we'll find out. I'm optimistic. I certainly think it's the best chance that we've had in a generation in this country. And that's a big part of why I'm supporting Donald Trump and why I'm going to do everything in my power to help him. But I do think it is going to take a spine of steel to see that through. And then after we've taken on the regulatory state, I think that's the next step. But I do think there's this broader project of dismantling the nanny state in all of its forms, the entitlement state, the regulatory state, and the foreign policy nanny state. 3-word answer, if I was to summarize my worldview and my presidential campaign in 3 words: shut it down.
Shut it down. Okay, so the Supreme Court cases you mentioned, there's a lot of nuance there.
Yeah.
I guess it's weakening the immune system of the different departments.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it.
Okay.
Yep.
On the human psychology level, so you basically kind of implied that for Donald Trump or for any president, the legal situation was difficult. Is that the only thing really operating? Like, isn't it
Probably
also
not.
just on a psychological level, just hard to fire a very large number of people? Is that what it is? Like, why is there a basic civility and momentum going on?
I think there's one other factor. So you're right to point. I mean, the legal backdrop is a valid and understandable excuse and reason. I think there are other factors at play too. So I think there's something to be said for never having been in government, showing up there the first time, and you're having to understand the rules of the road as you're operating within them, and also having to depend on people who actually aren't aligned with your policy vision, but tell you to your face that they are. And so I think that's one of the things that I've admired about President Trump is he's actually been very open about that, very humble about that, to say that there's a million learnings from that first term that make him ambitious and more ambitious in that second term. But everything I'm talking to you about, this is what needs to happen in the country. It's not specific to Donald Trump. It's lays out what needs to be done in the country. There's the next 4 years. Donald Trump is our last best hope and chance for moving that ball forward. But I think that the vision I'm laying out here is one that hopefully goes even beyond just the next 2 or 4 years of really fixing a century's worth of mistakes. I think we're going to fix a lot of them in the next 4 years of Donald Trump's president. But if you have a century's worth of mistakes that have accumulated with the overgrowth of the entitlement state in the U.S., I think it's going to take, probably the better part of a decade at least to actually fix them.
I disagree with you on both the last and the best hope. Donald Trump is more likely to fire a lot of people, but is he the best person to do so?
We got 2 candidates, right? People face a choice. This is a relevant election. One of my goals is to speak to people who may not agree with 100% of what who do not agree with 100% of what Donald Trump says. And I can tell them, you know what? I don't agree with 100% of what he says. And I can tell you, as somebody who ran against him for U.S. president, that right now he is, when I say the last best hope, I mean in this cycle, the last best hope that we have for dismantling that bureaucratic class. And, I think that I'm also open about the fact that it's going to take, this is a long run project, but we have the next step to actually take over the next few years. That's kind of where I land on it. I mean, you talked to him, I guess, a few weeks ago. I saw you had a podcast with him, right? What was your impression about his preparedness to do it?
My impression is his priority allocation was different than yours. I think he's more focused on some of the other topics that you are also focused on.
Laser focused on.
And there is a tension there, just as you've clearly highlighted.
We share the same priority with respect to the southern border, and those are near-term fixes that we can hit out of the park in the first year. But at the same time, I think we got to think also on decade-long time horizons. So my own view is, I think that it is my conviction and belief that he does care about dismantling that federal bureaucracy, certainly more so than any Republican nominee we have had certainly in my lifetime. But I do think that there are going to be competing schools of thought where some will say, okay, well, we want to create a right-wing entitlement state, right? To shower federal subsidies on favored industries while keeping them away from disfavored industries and new bureaucracies to administer them. And, I don't come from that school of thought. I don't want to see the bureaucracy expand in a pro-conservative direction. I want to see the bureaucracy shrink in every direction. And, I do think that from my conversations with Donald Trump, I believe that he is well aligned with this vision of shrinking bureaucracy, but that's a longer-term project.
There's so many priorities at play here, though. I mean, you really do have to do the Elon thing of walking into Twitter headquarters
Shut it down
with a sink, right? Let that sink in. That basically firing a very large number of people. And it's not just about the firing. It's about setting clear missions for the different departments that remain, hiring back because you overfire, hiring back based on meritocracy. I mean, it's a full-time. And it's not only full-time in terms of actual time, it's full-time psychologically because you're walking into a place, unlike a company like Twitter, an already successful company. In government, I mean, everybody around you, all the experts and the advisors are going to tell you you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it's a very difficult psychological place to operate in because like you're constantly the asshole. And I mean, the certainty you have to have about what you're doing is just like nearly infinite because all the really smart people are telling you, no, this is a terrible idea. Sir, this is a terrible idea.
No, you have to have this spine of steel to cut through what that short-term advice is you're getting. And I'll tell you, certainly, I intend to do whatever I can for this country, both in the next 4 years and beyond. But my voice on this will be crystal clear. And President Trump knows that's my view on it. And I believe he shares it deeply, is that all else equal, get in there and shut down as much of the excess bureaucracy as we can, do it as quickly as possible. And that's a big part of how we save our country.
Okay, I'll give you an example that's really difficult tension, given your priorities. Immigration. There's an estimated 14 million illegal immigrants in the United States. You've spoken about mass deportation.
Yes.
That requires a lot of effort.
Right.
Money. I mean, like, how do you do it? And how does that conflict with the shutting it down?
Sure. And so it goes back to that original discussion we had is what are the few proper roles of the federal government? I gave you two. One is of the government, period. One is to protect the national borders and sovereignty of the United States, and two is to protect private property rights. There's a lot else. Most of what the government's doing today, both at the federal and state level, is something other than those two things. But in my book, those are the two things that are the proper function of government. So for everything else the federal government should not be doing, the one thing they should be doing is to protect the homeland of the United States of America and the sovereignty and sanctity of our national borders. So in that domain, that's mission aligned with a proper purpose for the federal government. I think we're a nation founded on the rule of law. I say this as the kid of legal immigrants. That means your first act of entering this country cannot break the law. And in some ways, if I was to summarize a formula for saving the country over the next 4 years, it would be a tale of two mass deportations. The mass deportations of millions of illegals who are in this country and should not be, and then the mass deportation of millions of unelected federal bureaucrats out of Washington, D.C. Now, all else equal, you could say that those are in tension, but I think that the reality is anything outside of the scope of what the core function of the government is, which is protecting borders and protecting private property rights, that's really where I think the predominant cuts need to be. And if you look at the number of people who are looking after the border, it's not even 0.1% of the federal employee base today. So 75% isn't 99.99%, it's 75%, which still leaves that it would still be a tiny fraction of the remaining 25%, which I actually think needs to be more rather than less. So it's a good question, but that's sort of where I land on when it's a proper role of the federal government, great, act and actually do your job. The irony is 99.9999% of those resources are going to functions other than the protection of private property rights and the protection of our national physical protection.
There is a lot of criticism of the idea of mass deportation, though. So one,
fair enough,
it would cause a large amount of economic harm, at least in the short term. The other is there would be potentially violations of our kind of higher ideals of how we like to treat human beings, in particular, separation of families. for example, tearing families apart. And the other is just like the logistical complexity of doing something like this. How do you answer some of those criticisms like this?
So fair enough. And I would call those even not even criticisms, but just thoughtful questions, right? Even if somebody who's really aligned with doing this, those are thoughtful questions to ask.